Ashok Vajpeyi is a widely respected poet, writer, essayist, literary critic, and foremost observer of India's millennia-old continuing civilization. In an interview with Mayank Chhaya Reports, Mr. Vajpeyi holds forth on broader cultural, intellectual, and civilizational themes at a time when India is in the midst of great collective pain and frustration. Mr. Ashok Vajpeyi.
वहां वह बेहद गर्मी में पानी का गिलास उठाती है। यहां मैं जानता हूं कि ठीक उसी समय मेरी प्यास बुझ रही है। ये आप ही ने कहा है। What does it mean to
Okay.
be what does it mean to be a poet in the time of a pandemic, in the time of extra pain, in the time of extra death?
Well, it's in many ways difficult. In many ways, it draws upon certain abiding resources, both in language and in your own interiority, if I may say so. So it's a very trying time in that sense. When the pandemic started and the lockdown took place, uh, late last year in April, I in fact wrote a poem in which I said, "No, we won't be able to write our time
I see.
because it is a time in which others are invisible, in which each one has become, in a manner of speaking, danger to everybody else. So it was kind of a situation in which uh, poetry has to address this imposed loneliness, isolation, distancing at one level. At another level, it has to keep, in a sense, being witness to what's happening. Poetry as witness, as Joshua Ghosh famously said
Right.
in his Nobel lecture. So, and thirdly, it is to still acknowledge that while the social world has come to a standstill, life continues in spite of everything. Uh, Nature completely unaffected by the epidemic, at least as far as we know as of now. So these are elements which make it a very complex phenomena to write poetry.
Right.
It can be a lament. It can be a damning documentation or document of witness. It could be a prayer for well-being for everybody. It could be a cry in despair. Uh, so it it has to be many things. And I published a selection of my poems and prose pieces written during the pandemic in
I see.
January when I turned 18. And I called it Thoda Sa Ujala,
Acha.
a little light.
Ji.
Uh, well, I mean, in the sense that uh, poets are, even when they are deeply uh, rooted in despair and hopelessness, uh, they still cling to hope. Uh, they still think that they can uh, put the alternative of hope on the table, on which there are all kinds of evils and
Right.
despairing elements. So that's it. It's a long answer. I'm sorry.
No. That's the format of my interviews anyway. I always like that. Sorry to be a bit conceited here, but since you were talking about poetry and poet, I've been writing myself since the age of 13, and one of the verses that came to me my mind when you were talking about hope was "Rafta rafta hum nikal aayenge is sailab se." रफ्ता रफ्ता हम
Uh,
निकल आएंगे इस सैलाब से कुछ कहेंगे अपने किस्से और सुनेंगे अहबाब से so
yeah,
interesting you should mention how nature the rest of nature apart from human beings continues at its own pace in that
yeah.
context I'm reminded of your own writing about चींटियों का कोई इतिहास नहीं होता uh,
Yes. Mm,
जी बताइए
In, yes, in the sense that you see, there's a life which we think life as only human life.
right
When you are put in an extreme situation where human life more or less withdraws, becomes invisible, all that you have by way of evidence of human life is your own life and your life of your family members, etc., who are around you. But life is beyond the human. There's a lot of non-human which is alive and kicking. And so I when I wrote the poem that no, we can't write our time, I also wrote poems in which, unmindful of what has happened to Homo sapiens
right
on the earth, uh, the birds, as it were, early morning bring the sun. So everything else keeps on happening as if nothing has happened.
right
Now that makes you uh, kind of a another isolation. That how little in this other life you participate. You in fact have been interfering in it. You have been trying to exploit it. You have been trying to muzzle it. And sometimes you're trying to do things which are absolutely unpardonable from the environmental point of view. But this is what we have been doing. So, in a sense, it makes you aware that how, at one level, in the Indian tradition, nature is very much in empathy with the human. At another level, you realize the nature is indifferent to the human.
right
So it's a kind of an ambiguity you're faced in such times because you all of a sudden realize that the people tree or the flowers or the green grass on the lawns goes on. It is unmindful of what is happening to human beings. So, in a certain sense, there is a kind of a indifference, and at another level, through poetry and through arts, etc., we have been trying to sort of get our metaphors, our images, life and hope and even despair from nature. Nature is a great source of poetry, and yet it is so indifferent to poetry and to
true
the humans. So that creates a kind of another kind of a loneliness that human beings are so alone.
Absolutely, absolutely. You said poetry is not bound by the time in which it is created, and yet
Yeah.
it addresses that time. As a poet of eminence, how would you address the time that India is going through now at various levels and yet not be bound by it?
Well, I mean, if you go by the regular channels of information, that is media and electronic channels, etc., what India is undergoing is a tremendous tragedy, um, partly uh, partly created elsewhere
Right.
and who's been infiltrated into the country, and partly by human failings, by failings, more importantly, of the state to anticipate and to be prepared for it. But apart from this, apart from all that is happening, the desire to live, the zest to survive remains unabated. And that creates a kind of another time that you try to, all poetry is rooted in time. You cannot avoid time because time is hanging heavy on you. It's at the window, it's at the door, it's in the bedroom, it's everywhere. So time is, but any time, however vast it may be, also accommodates other times. And one of the jobs of poetry is to remember and to recall and to liberate you from the confines of your own time. You cannot liberate yourself from your own time without firstly being deeply immersed in that time. That is you cannot override time, you cannot avoid time, you cannot get away. If you go through time to the timeless, to what is beyond time in a certain sense. So again, this is a very complex phenomena. And when I talked about that you not only address time, you also address, Joseph Brodsky famously said that you do not always write for your contemporaries, you also write for your ancestors. So they would be, in a manner of speaking, listening to your voice and what you do. So there is a whole past which is watching you, which is listening to you, which is trying uh, to give you uh, an intimation of being there.
Right.
And on the other hand, in the given time, you're always thinking of the alternative time. Actually, I wrote a whole book on the arts in Hindi called Samay Se Bahar, in
Ji.
which my basic concept was that arts create another time as against the given time, which doesn't mean that they override or forget or avoid that time, but through that time, they create another time, a time of possibility, hope, a time of discovery, a time of invention, etc. So, I think a great poet would be one. Of course, I'm not, but those who are great are able to connect time with the timelessness meaningfully, sensuously, spiritually, and of course, uh, linguistically. Let us not forget, poetry is also a storehouse of racial memory. There are many other storehouses. Music is one, other arts forms are one. Knowledge itself is a storehouse of memory because you remember what has happened earlier and then you try to find a way which is different or apart from that. But the others are there. Therefore, there is this other time also, which is, in a manner of speaking, hinging on you.
Right. The profundity of what you're saying uh, is something I would presume elude ordinary lives obsessed with daily survival like a majority of people have to do. How do you think they can unshackle themselves from that kind of subsistence, existential level concern and get into the kind of conceit that we are talking about here about time, etc.? Do you think people have the luxury of rising above their daily challenges and think in terms that we are thinking now?
Well, everybody, just as everybody has humanity in him or her, everybody has imagination in him or her, everybody has creativity in him or her. Similarly, everybody has the capacity to go beyond one's given time, the time in which one struggles to survive, to make two ends meet, etc., etc. After all, let us look at our ritualistic world. A whole lot of rituals which we perform, whether it is through fairs or through melas or through worship and various festivities. And we all try to, ordinary people, create symbolic structures. You put a lump of clay, put some vermilion on it, and it becomes an image of God. Now, this is an act of imagination,
Right.
which we keep on doing. The difficulty is that our educational system and other systems which educate us apart from education do not encourage imagination. It is one of the basic failings of education the world over, I think, but more so in India,
Hmm.
where imagination and knowledge attained by imagination is somewhat undervalued. In fact, the fact that literature and arts also offer a kind of knowledge is hardly acceptable in the citadels of knowledge. They believe that science is knowledge and philosophy is knowledge, all that. Perhaps literature and arts are not knowledge. They are more sensuous knowledge. They are knowledge which tell you how to be a human being, tell you how to be a sensitive, empathetic human being, how to look at the world around you in a in an imaginative, sensitive manner.
Right. To bring it down to a little more mundane level, Naipaul had spoken about 1,000 mutinies in India, a description that probably fits India even now very well. I would call it, as I said, 1,000 ferments. How do you think the pandemic and all its terrible spin offs might distort or affect India's culture in the long run?
Well, at one level, I have deep despair. At another level, I remain clinging to hope. The present situation where consumerism, corporate greed, uh, communalism, casteism, religious bigotry, disregard of justice and equality, these factors have come together in a very dangerous and a very potent combination, which are at the which are destroying or at least attempting to destroy whatever was the most noble, most uplifting, the most human, the most civilizing in the Indian tradition. And all this is being done in the name of Indian tradition. You can't have a greater irony than that. Uh, the levels that have been reached of hatred, discrimination, demonization of others, um, the they are amazing. But obviously, there has been a streak in the Indian society which had all along been nourishing, sustaining this evil, this evil interpretation of Indian culture. So, what you have is a situation in which some of the basic tenets of culture, Indian culture, is not merely a culture, but it's a civilization. And all too often, we forget that we are one of the few civilizations which has survived. You know, some of the great civilizations, the Egyptian and the Mayan and the Aztec and the Roman and the Greek have all disappeared. Uh, Perhaps China has similar civilizational survival. India is one of them. And Indian civilization from the beginning is marked by plurality. You know, we don't have a holy book.
Right.
We don't have a Bible. We don't have a Quran. What we have are four Vedas. We have 18 Upanishads. We have six schools of classical philosophy. We have two epics. We have any number of languages, any number of gods. After all, we have 33 million gods, 330 million gods. Surely at one time our human population would not have been all that big. So our divine population was far in excess of our human population.
Right.
We have plurality of custom, costume, cuisine, what you have. Now, this is one part, plurality and accommodation, openness as part of a civilizational enterprise. On the other hand, and these Hindutva votaries have to answer that if Hinduism was all that pervasive and self satisfying a phenomena, why did we have three more religions? They did not come to us from outside: Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism.
Right.
My interpretation is these are religions of descent. They descended from the Hindu, whatever mainstream was. And I have, in fact, done a book, which I showed. It's called India Descents.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is 3,000 years of difference, doubt, and argument. Now, Indian civilization has been marked by epical debates in philosophy, in thought, in epics. Remember Mahabharata? The great debates about moral conduct, about what is Raj Dharma, about what is good or bad, etc. So there were debates and there were different viewpoints, and all had a place. My own contention is that Indian democracy is not a gift of the West to India entirely. There were elements in our own tradition which was deeply democratic. If there is, you know, in Mahabharata, while Bhishma is lying on Sharshaya, the bed of arrows, both Duryodhan and Yudhishthir go to him, asking him what is Raj Dharma. And Yudhishthir, Bhishma Pitama says, and you listen to, he says many things about Raj Dharma, but I'll pick up only two. One, that the king must not engage foolish and greedy people in statecraft. Two, it is the duty of the king to secure his people from all kinds of fears. Not only this, let's go to Ramacharitas, which is the more popular epic, in which when Ram is coronated in Ayodhya, Lanka has been won over and everything is hunky dory. Then Ram addresses the citizens of Ayodhya and says, if I ever commit something which is unethical, aniti, then, my dear brothers, interrupt without fear. You interrupt the king without fear.
Right.
Now, these are elements in our tradition. Kabir, in his Sadho Ye Murdon Ka Gaon, says that everybody will die, the king and the people and this, that and the other, and even gods will die. Devta bhi marenge. So, see, this is a great tradition. It's a pagan tradition of plurality, accommodation, openness, and allowing the, go back to the Vedas again. There is Yas was a rishi who put together various interpretations of the Vedas. And one of the interpretation given by a rishi called Kauntya says that if it was being said that Vedas are apaurushaya, it cannot be translated into any other language, to which Kauntya says that if Vedas cannot be translated into another language, that means they have no meaning, because meaning has to be translated.
Right.
Now, this is a heresy way back in the Vedic period, but Yas includes this interrogative interpretation within his compilation of interpretations of. So there's not merely, let's further go to the Rigveda. In Rigveda, there is this Nasadiya Sukt, hymn of creation, where the Rishi, after having described the great universe, etc., etc., then says, but when there was no light and there was no darkness, there was no presence, no absence, no being, no non being. What was there? And then he says, maybe he who has created this universe Dhaka, he would know. And then the skeptic enters. Maybe even he doesn't know. This isn't Rigved. We are a proud heirs of this tradition.
Right.
At this point, I asked Mr. Vajpeyi to contextualize the rise of Hindutva against the backdrop of India's millennia old tradition of intellectual dissent and interrogation of even some of the most fundamental aspects of scriptural wisdom.
The so-called Hindutva is really an ideology, a political ideology. It has nothing to do with religion because it is based on complete misunderstanding of Hinduism. Nothing can be farther from Hinduism than Hindutva.
Right.
Let us take some of the Aptvakyas of the Hindu tradition. One, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is my family. If the whole world is my family, how could I be hating some members of my own family? One. Two, Eko Ham Bahusyama. I am one, but many. In fact, India's civilizational enterprise has been to create oneness through manyness, if you like. We are many, therefore we are one. Three, Ekam Sad Vipraha Baudha Vadanti. Truth is one, however, the wise men speak differently of it. Now, if you take all this to the core of Hinduism, and I'm quoting merely from the Hindu text,
Right.
I'm not adding anything. They would give you a version of Hinduism which is open, which is pagan, which is pluralistic, which is accommodative, which is not afraid of dissent. After all, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism emerged in India and they were accommodated. Just as Islam and Christianity and Judaism came from outside and were accommodated. We are perhaps the most multi-religious, multilingual country in the world. And we should be proud of it. Rather than creating a situation where these religious groups are fighting among each other and there's communal hatred and there is demonization of the other. Every day others are being created. In fact, there were no others to the Indian civilization.
Right.
And Indian civilization has a record of having been in dialogue with Romans, with Greeks, with Persians. And if you look at the whole, what has come out very poignantly is the famous Narsingh Mehta's hymn that Gandhiji was fond of. Vaishnav Janto Tene Kahiye.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Vajpeyi. Just for a second, sorry for the interruption. It's been my 20, 30-year-old obsession. I made a full-length feature documentary on that very song. I'll send you the link to it.
Yes.
It's called Gandhi.
And what is it saying?
Yeah.
Pain of the others.
Right.
And pain of the others, the otherness of the others, if you do not feel and accept it, you are not a Vaishnava.
Right.
You are not a human being,
right.
A civilized human being. That's what Susan Sontag said, pain of the others. Now, how are you going to divide geography of pain into communities and and caste. And yes, caste system has been one of our major structural problems. In fact, at the heart of the Indian crisis lies the paradox. Our metaphysics is so liberating. Our social structure is so constricting.
Exactly.
But hopefully, this pandemic has made everybody untouchable. You had only relegated millions of Dalits to untouchability at one level. Now you are as untouchable as anybody else.
Exactly.
Whether you are a great Brahmin or a man with great power or whatever, you are equally untouchable. So, I mean, I don't know where I started, but we must realize this, that the present juncture is a betrayal of the Hindu tradition. It is a betrayal of Indian civilization. It is a betrayal of Indian tradition and thought, even of the ancient and medieval times, not to talk about the modern thought, which was contributed and created by people like Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose, etc., Sri Aurobindo. They all contributed to a multiplicity of thought, which we are in. And we are being every day pilloried with fakes and falsehood and, I mean, regard for knowledge, esteem for science have declined so pathetically in these few years that we are no longer a knowledge producing country. We are no longer a science producing country. We merely borrow technologies and then speak the falsehood. We borrowed this technology, the vaccination technology from some Oxford-based institution, and we are creating. So we are only recipients of technology. Even in the field of technology, our contribution is very poor. What have we contributed by way of technology which might have a world application? So science and knowledge are particularly, today I was reading somewhere that several members of parliament and some minister and some office bearers of the BJP have issued okay as to how to face coronavirus, and it prescribes that in the morning you take such an amount of cow urine, and then you perhaps eat some cow dung, and then put it on your body, have a kind of a dung bath, and things like that. I mean, can you believe a country where knowledge was such supreme could be given to such stupid and being sanctified,
Right.
being propagated, and there we are. I mean, it's a sad thing, but it has revealed to us. The pandemic has revealed to us how poor, how backward, and how devalued we are now in terms of knowledge and science.
Right. It's interesting
Now,
you should mention that. I was coming to that particular aspect about the general disdain that this current ideological dispensation has shown for something which is even remotely intellectual or even ruminative. Why do you think that is? Do they feel threatened, or
You
they
see,
just generally don't have enough to process it? What is the problem?
the problem is that none of them. I mean, you don't expect Narendra Modi and Amit Shah to be well read either, unlike Nehru or Jayaprakash Narayan, Gandhi, and all that. I mean, they are culturally, intellectually illiterate people. One. Now, if you are illiterate, both culturally and intellectually, then you tend to believe, because you are in power, you have got power somehow, that knowledge is an obstacle to power. Intellect is an impediment. So, what they have systematically done in the past 7 or 8 years, devalued some of the best universities we have. JNU, Jamia Millia, Hyderabad University, Aligarh Muslim University, etc., etc. And so there you have a situation where mediocrity is today the ruling deity. Even in culture, most of the national institutions are headed by people who are known, if at all, for their mediocrity and not for their excellence or any attainments to date. Now, if you are going to create a politics which is based on hatred, based on discrimination, based on inequality and injustice, based on violence and rapes and murders, then you can't be a party to knowledge. Because knowledge would tell you this is all absurd, this is inhuman, this is uncivilized, this is un-Hindu, this is un-Indian. And so you have a systematic campaign to create amnesia. Every day from the top, lies are spoken. And they are unfortunately repeated in electronic media discussions as if they are great truths. Everything, I mean, there has never been, I think, a government which has promoted and which has sort of got sustenance from lies as this government. So the republic of imagination, the republic of knowledge, the republic of creativity, the republic of conscience, the republic of interrogation, the republic of debate and dissent, all are being crushed. Now, this is the whole picture now. But Indian civilization has survived many upheavals. Indian democracy has also survived many interruptions. After all, we survived emergency, etc. So, as a poet and as a human being, as an incorrigibly optimistic Indian, I continue to hope that it will survive. The damage done would be tremendous. What is going to happen, and I'm more concerned with that, it is that the Hindu society itself is now going to be terribly, terrifyingly fragmented. It always was in a certain sense. It was not a very homogeneous society, but a substantial part of it will be bought over, has been bought over by hatred and a desire to take revenge and to feel victimhood.
Right.
That is so. The problem is not what is going to happen to other society. Problem is that there will be a strong, violent, ignorant, hateful section of Hindu society which will remain and which will be a constant threat both to the Hindu ethos, to the Hindu vision of life, and to the democratic ethos, the democratic structure. Let me point out to you that our constitution, the Indian constitution, which is one of the largest well-written constitutions of the world, tried to create a new social religion away from the traditional religions and create a trinity of values which should be pursued in social conduct and social affairs, which included the state affairs: freedom, equality, and justice. But all our 8 religions have fallen behind and have not openly accepted these values: freedom, equality, and justice.
Right.
So we have a situation where our democracy demands adherence to values of freedom, equality, and justice. But our religions do not subscribe openly and courageously to these values.
Right.
They are not willing. Now, there's going to be also a unfortunately, this should not happen, but it's going to happen. The divide between the north and the south is going to take sharper delineations. The Hindi belt, at least Uttar Pradesh, is going to be a, an, an area of violence, hatred, communalism, casteism, etc., injustice, exploitation, rapes, murders. But the South, where incidentally some of our most revered temples and other traditions are well preserved, has already departed from this version of Hinduism. So there are, in a manner of speaking, 2 kinds of Hinduism appearing: a southern Hinduism and a northern Hinduism.
Right.
And this will not be a very healthy development, but in some ways it will work as a restraint, as a kind of a resistance to this North Hinduism,
Right.
which may not be very prevalent in most areas of North, but as Pratap Bhanu Sharma today has said in an article, it may be confined to UP, might not have much impact elsewhere, but UP being the most populous state will have a very important role to play. Now, that is going to happen. Incidentally, it is also noticeable that during the pandemic, and particularly during the second wave, even in the first wave, when these millions of migrant laborers were left abandoned, fend for themselves in very pathetic condition with the home, help, assistance, succor, relief, food, water, not provided by the state, but by community initiatives.
Right.
And at the top of these initiatives were the Gurudwaras and the masjids. In the second wave also, the Gurudwaras have gone a further step. They have created hospitals in Gurudwaras with oxygen cylinders and all everything being free. Now, our religious Hindu temple, I'm a Hindu, have enormous amount of money. Why aren't they spending this money on the people who need help? What could be a better dharma at this time than this? But this is not happening. It's happening in a very slow, very reluctant way. So, what is going to happen? These things will not go unnoticed by people. I see on Facebook calls that if you want to contribute towards the help, towards helping people in Corona crisis, donate it to Gurudwaras because they will be put to use there. Do not donate it to other institutions because they eat them up.
Right.
Now, there is therefore a community, a new feeling of community, of help, conscience, empathy emerging. Now, if that spirit remains and eventually develops into a sufficiently substantial social force, it can create a different social climate. It can contribute towards create a social climate.
Right.
Mr. Mohan Bhagwat of the RSS the other day said that those who died have attained mukti. Now, can you imagine a whole obscene and insulting comment on people who are floating, whose bodies are floating in the Ganga? It has been now reported by a section of media that at least 2,000 bodies have been identified to be floating in UP alone, not to speak of Bihar. And now saying Mukti Paget. I mean, this is masterly misreading of Gita.
It is.
People who have not been able to get a place on the cremation grounds or in the Kabristan for burial, their bodies are being floated on Ganga. And this is what a cultural organization's leader says. This is, I mean, to say the least, this is the most anti-Hindu statement. However, let's go a step further. You think, utopians, whatever their utopia, either have the utopia in the future or the utopia in the past. So either you have a golden age in the past or you have a golden age to aspire to. Now, in their case, the golden age is in the past.
Right.
Right, fine. Have you created a great world-class institution of Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit?
No.
Classical languages in India? Have you created a great institution of Indian philosophy? Classical Indian philosophy. Incidentally, 4 of these Indian classical philosophies do not talk about God. They are concerned with the universe, logic, etc. But have you created such an institution? You have devalued the existing institutions. You have demonized them. You have interfered with them. But have you created? Where are these great institutions? Have you created a great institution of Hindu thought? Now, you see, talking in the air, creating victimhood, creating fake. I'll give you an example. Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, the Gujarati painter, has mentioned this. Akbar got Valmiki's Ramayana translated into Persian.
Mhm.
Translation was done. Now, in those days, there was no printing presses. One or two manuscripts were created. But a royal manuscript has to be illustrated. So, painters from Kashmir, from Rajasthan, from Gwalior, from elsewhere were all brought together. Now, they all came with their individual styles. But they sat together, evolved a common style of painting, which was meant to be illustrating the translation of Ramayana into Persian. And that is known as the Mughal style.
Right.
Do you know this? Do many people know this? That the Mughal style was created out of a need to illustrate the Persian translation
Of the
of
Ramayana.
Ramayana
Right.
commissioned by Akbar. Now, you can't, therefore, ignorance is necessary. Ignorance is necessary. Unfortunately, even the educated ones, at least in North India, the educated have fared no better in terms of hatred. It is the middle class which are dying to go to America, at least their children, which have already ceded from India in a certain sense.
Right.
They have no knowledge of, no curiosity about, no interest in Indian traditions. I mean, there's a lot in Indian tradition which is unwanted, which is undesirable, should be discarded. Sure, that's what the Bhakti poets did. When they came on the scene, they questioned the ritualism. In Kabir, you have questioning both the Hindus and the Muslims, and this is being done in the Vatican city of Hinduism, Banaras. He is making fun of both sides. Pande tum nipun kasai. Mr. Pandey, you are a very dexterous butcher.
Right.
And on the other hand, he's saying, चीटी के पग नेवर बाजे सो तेरा साहिब सुनता है ऊंची चढ़ के बांग लगाए क्या तेरा साहिब बहरा है. He's
Right.
commenting on Azam. Incidentally, I don't particularly agree with this. Azam is very beautiful music and all that, but that's not the matter. And here is Tulsidas, who creates an republic of imagination in Ramacharitas to the Mughal empire. So there is another empire being created in poetry.
Right.
All this is part of the tradition. All this is not something which one has to import from anywhere. This is all there. What you have done? Nothing. In fact, our prime minister went to Kabir's Maghar, where he is buried, and both there is a qabr and there is samadhi side by side. And he said, here, Kabir used to have a dialogue with Guru Gorakhnath, and Nanak. Nanak and Gorakhnath. Gorakhnath was 200 years before Kabir, and Nanak was 200 years after Kabir. Now, this is the kind of knowledge, shall we say, utter ignorance that you are operating from. So, what is happening is that in India today, in the eyes of the powers that be, knowledge, memory, plurality, accommodation, openness, empathy are all but insults which have to be shunned. There you are.
Well, you essentially addressed about 8 of the questions that I had, which I'm glad about. So I'll just wrap it up with the last two, if you don't mind. One is, how do you see the democratization of the tool to express opinions, as it were? Not just an informed opinion, but any opinion brought about by social media technologies such as Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or any number of those. How do you think these technologies have led to a kind of disintermediation that the traditional gatekeepers have been opposed to, in the sense you see a very indiscriminate flow of anything goes sort of thing on the internet these days? People confuse having an opinion with having knowledge. How do you think a civilization like India can battle that?
Well, the technology is a universal phenomena. It has come to India. It is being misused in a huge manner by powers that be and by all those who want to spread hatred, misunderstanding, fakery, etc. What's interesting, the same technology is also being used to spread real substantial news, truth, other kinds of ideas, other interpretations, other facts, other aspects. So I tend to get that I suffer from a certain ambiguity about it. There's a lot on it which spreads lies and hatred, this, that, and the other, misunderstanding, its fakeness about everything. On the other hand, uh, it is through the social media that we get a glimpse of reality. And therefore, I think, well, it's easier said than done. It has been said that they should be self-regulatory and but they have their own politics. We have seen how Facebook and others have been acting, because you see, the immorality or the immorality of technology is reaching its extreme. Say, we are merely an instrument. You are not. You're not only an instrument, you carry a certain value load with it. You carry certain assumptions with it. So it's not such a neutral technology as you claim.
Right.
So it's a question of, I mean, if supposing we didn't have social media, Facebook, and all this, we would have not known what is happening. We wouldn't have known that 2,000 bodies are floating in Ganga in Uttar Pradesh alone. We wouldn't have known that what these guys who are promoting, who are suggesting that we should drink cow urine and cow dung are doing. We wouldn't have known all this. So there is a there's a value to it, but so you have to balance it. I'm not very excited. I mean, I myself am the target for a lot of hate mails and things of that kind. I don't bother, but there are lesser beings who will get influenced by.
Yeah. Before I've already overshot my time by about 6 minutes. The last bit that I would like to address, if you don't mind, in the midst of all this, what's your current poetic impulse? Is there something that you might like to recite to wrap up what we are talking about, which is current and maybe it's a response to what you're feeling right now?
Well, instead of talking blah blah blah, I read a poem.
Please, please.
You see, I write in Hindi, so
जी जी बिल्कुल
I don't practice. It's almost the last one I have written. जो मेरे पास नहीं था उसे ही मैं कविता में लाता रहा. जलप्रपात, देवता, पूर्वज, बचपन के घर के सामने छूट गए कठचंदन और बकोली के पेड़. मैं कविता में नहीं लाया मोहल्ले की खुली हुई बदबूदार नालियां, गर्मियों में पिछवाड़े की बावड़ी के पास रात पानी सींच कर खेला गया चोपड़े का खेल, या एक नाई युवक द्वारा बड़ी बहनों पर रखी जाती नजर. मैं कविता में बचा पाया जो मेरे पास नहीं था. ये भी एक मोहक भ्रम है. कविता कुछ बचा पाती है, अपने को बचा ले यही गनीमत. ये सवाल भी तो फिर उठता है कि वास्तव में बचाने से कविता में बचाना क्या बेहतर है, अगर पूरी तरह से मानवीय नहीं. फिर बचाकर होगा क्या? अपने जीवन का कबाड़ बेकार होती चीजें जिन्हें अपना नाम तक याद नहीं, और स्मृतियां और लोग और छवियां और कभी उफनता क्रोध, कभी अचानक हुआ उल्लास, इन सबको बचाकर क्या होगा? बस कविता जरूर भारी हो जाएगी, जबकि हल्के का जमाना है. इतना झमेला है तो कविता के पास गया ही क्यों? अगर बोझ कुछ भारी हो जाए कविता की वजह से, तो ज्यादातर लोग उसे बाहर निकाल कर फेंक देते हैं. क्या सिर्फ इसलिए कि जो मेरे पास नहीं था उसे कविता में ही लाया रखा जा सकता था.
वाह वाह वाह. मैं भी कुछ before I came for this interview, I was reading some of your other poetry. It struck me that आप छोटे वजन की काफी लिखते हैं कविता. Pretty short. Brevity seems to be something that seems to guide you.
Yes. And in fact, I have a lot of very short poems.
अच्छा.
Let me see if I have one. Yeah. हवा में कोई खिड़की नहीं थी, पर उस नीली चिड़िया के उड़ने से बन गई. हवा की दीवार नहीं थी, पर उसमें एक खिड़की अकस्मात खुल गई.
वाह वाह. This is almost, it's almost like a haiku.
बहुत दिनों से
जी.
बहुत दिनों से ईश्वर आया नहीं हमारी ओर. बहुत दिनों से उसका उगना ऊँघना सिसकना देखा सुना नहीं. बहुत दिनों से पता नहीं चला वो अब भी है या नहीं.
On that note, Mr. Vajpeyi, it was stimulating, and I want to thank you very much for your time and enthusiasm. I know you had other things to do, but I'm grateful for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.